Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining. We're excited to have everybody here today, and we're really looking forward to sharing insights into the Just Capital Racial Equity Tracker. We are going to wait just one more minute as participants file in, but we are excited to see you all here today. So thanks for joining. Glad to have you from all parts of the world. We have a good amount of registered participants, so happy to be here and happy to get started. We're going to give it 30 more seconds and then I'll start with a few housekeeping tools. Let me share our beautiful deck. And great, so everybody should be able to see the deck. And before we get started, just want to share a few housekeeping details. All participants will be on mute. There will be a question and answer session at the end of the session. So feel free to keep questions or drop them in the chat. And additionally, we will be sharing the deck upon request. So if you want to have the deck for later, please let us know. We will also have the recording. So if any of your colleagues missed out and they want to learn more, happy to share that as well. So once we get started, today our agenda consists of an overview of the tracker, insights and top-line findings, a fireside interview with Intel, and framing of the broader racial equity work at Just Capital. Today, our speakers include myself. I'm Catalina Caro, the Senior Manager of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Just Capital. We have a special guest, Suzanne Follander, who is the Corporate Responsibility Director at Intel, and my two wonderful colleagues, Kavya Vogel, who's the Senior Director of Research at Just Capital, and Yusuf George, who is our Managing Director. And with that, I will turn it over to Yusuf.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for spending the time to be here with us today. I'm just going to do a bit of scene setting. As we all know, in the spring and summer of last year, racial equity was really propelled into the forefront of many of our minds, from the impact of COVID and what that did to Black and Brown communities, to the racial justice uprisings on account of the murders of Black Americans by police officers, none of which are new in this country, but for many, it was the first time that they'd actually had to pay attention because we were all home. This moment was equally important for business leaders, for CEOs, for members of the C-suite, for board directors, because they were also at home and they realized the impact that these events and what it did to their workers, to their communities, and honestly to themselves. It was a moment where they recognized the role that they played in helping to shape and advance racial equity within this country. And in turn, they began to publicly acknowledge how systemic racism impacts their stakeholders, their workforces, their communities, and society in general. As many of you who are on this call know, our mission at Just Capital is to build a more just economy that works for all Americans. And we do this by helping companies improve how they serve their stakeholders. Racial equity is obviously a key issue of importance to stakeholders in this moment, to the public, to employees, to investors. And so we created a portfolio of work to help advance racial equity within corporate America. What we'll do over the course of this call is spend some time going through this. So I'll dig a little bit into our polling of the American public, which is really for us a way in which we help to define what materiality is. Research and analysis, my colleagues Catalina and Kavya are going to talk about the tracker that we recently released and some data and insights surrounding that. As the head of corporate engagement, I spend a lot of time working directly with companies to both drive transparency, but also to engage on performance. Like what does it look like to be best in class? And we'll hear from Suzanne at Intel about that. We spend a lot of time talking to investors and also doing campaigns with them. We work with large pension funds on a campaign related to EEO-1 and workforce demographic transparency. We spend a good bit of time on partnerships. We have one key one in racial equity, working with PolicyLink and FSG to create a multi-year initiative on racial equity standards, really defining a North Star for companies as it relates to their domains of influence within their workplace, in the communities that they operate in, and at societal level. And lastly, we put out tons of thought leadership. You can go to justcapital.com and find lots of insights and analysis. We also host webinars like this. We spend time hosting, private convenings with C-suite leaders, with CEOs and board members. If anyone is interested in those sort of convenings, please do reach out to myself or my team, and we can get you involved in one of those. But that really is how we are approaching, from a multi-tiered way, advancing racial equity within corporate America. As I mentioned, polling really helps to drive the core of our work. And both last summer and earlier this year, we went to the public and we asked, what are your expectations for companies in prioritizing diversity, equity, and inclusion? And more specifically, what are the concrete actions that corporate leaders should be taking to prioritize a movement towards greater racial equity? And what you see on here is examples of that. 95% of Black Americans said it is important for large companies to promote racial diversity in the workplace. And yet 83% of them said that companies have a lot more work to do on this issue. So we use this as a guidepost to say, well, what are the issues that we should be driving? And on the next slide, we get a little bit more specific. So it's a little hard to see here, but the first thing talks about conducting a pay equity analysis by demographic groups. And 91% of Black Americans believe that this is something that's important, and 85% of Americans generally do. And as you go down this list, and when we send out the deck, you'll be able to see a little bit more closely. Things like providing education and training is really important. Grievance mechanisms around discrimination is also something that is really important to the American public. So we use this polling as a way to drive the issues that we measure, specifically in the tracker. So Catalina Caro, my colleague, is going to spend some time actually walking you through the tracker and some of the insights that we've found.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Yusuf. So let's dig into the Corporate Racial Equity Tracker, why we created it, what we're measuring, and how to use it. Over the past year, we've seen corporate leaders really acknowledge the scale of racial injustice in our country, and many have made commitments to do their part to address these inequities. While companies have made statements of support and an unprecedented pace, it really remains challenging to assess how they're taking concrete actions to advance racial equity and diversity, equity, and inclusion. This is why we've launched the first iteration of the Corporate Racial Equity Tracker, which is our online tool that shows how America's 100 largest companies by employee size are following through on their commitments and the state of disclosure. As Yusuf illustrated, the majority of Americans continue to see a role for companies in promoting racial equity in the workplace and in society. And specifically for the past 3 years, we've seen that cultivates a diverse and inclusive workplace with equal opportunity for hiring, advancement, and pay without discrimination has claimed the 5th highest priority spot in the Just Capital polling. So we know that issues of racial equity and inclusion continue to be at the forefront of minds. I will go to the next slide. So what are we measuring? We are using our data that we have in the tracker, and we've really traced it up to these 6 different dimensions. And here, what goes into each of the dimensions, you can kind of see there's 22 data points in our tracker, and they all ladder up to each of these 6 dimensions. The dimensions in orange then ladder up to our workers stakeholder, and the dimensions in blue ladder up to our community stakeholders. And we're really trying to use this data to better understand the current state of disclosure around diversity, equity, and inclusion, and help workers, investors, and others access their data more easily to help incentivize and hold companies accountable for the commitments they made. Here we see the 22 data points. And to frame how these data points came about, I'll just reiterate our process of polling the American public. And we've heard for many years that this is really important. On the next slide, I'll show you the tracker. So once you get to the tracker, how do we actually use the tracker? We're just going to really quickly go over how to use the tracker. Let's see. You can all see the landing page on our website. When you get here, if you scroll all the way to the bottom, you actually see the tracker. But here you can click on the drill down, and that will bring up even more information. So what the tracker really illustrates is in its current iteration is a snapshot of the current state of disclosure. And here you can see there's a few different pieces that I'd like to point out. Right now, the tracker is organized by the estimated size of employees. So that's the order which these companies are listed in. On this right side, you can see the dimensions that the companies have. So for a dimension to show up here, a company must have at least one data point that ladders up to that dimension. We can dig in a bit deeper and go into the drill down and look at each dimension specifically. So if we click into pay equity, again, here you can order things by alphabet, you can order by number size, or you can even go through and order it by data point. So if you're looking for all the companies that have every single one of these points, you can see it all show up. Here, I'd also like to point out that if you click on the data point, then it actually leads you to where we found that information. So if we go back here, the other piece that I'd like to point out is that you can search by company. So you can search by company ticker, or you can search by company name. So if we click Intel, it leads you to a page where it has a comprehensive list of all of the data points, an explanation of what the data point is and whether the company has that data point. And again, if you click on here, it will lead you to where we found the information for that data point. So that was a really quick overview of how to use the tracker. And now I'll turn it over to my colleague, Kavya Vagul, who's our Director of Research, to talk about the insights and top-line findings that we found from the tracker.
Thanks so much, Kata. It's a pleasure to speak with you all about this today, and I highly encourage you to drill down into the actual tracker itself to see the company level information. What I'd like to talk about today is some of the higher level trends. And so we'll go to the next slide and you can see the overall findings of the tracker. So at large, this slide is presenting the percent or number of companies that have at least one disclosure across all 6 of the dimensions. You can see things like anti-discrimination policies, education and training programs, and community investments. The vast majority of companies have disclosure in these areas, but with pay equity, racial and ethnic diversity data, and response to mass incarceration, much fewer companies have disclosure. When we turn to the next slide, we'll talk about how all of this levels up. So what the previous slide showed was something that we began to notice in the tracker, a difference between commitments and actions. At the data point level, there are commitments, which are statements of generic policy that notes that a company is committed to a certain element of anti-discrimination or inclusion. And then there are actions, a program or disclosure or a policy that shows progress or accountability towards a commitment, or one that has an immediate impact. And so at the highest level, what we just saw gives us a little bit of a glimpse of this. We found that large companies, which are measured by US employment size, are highly likely to disclose general commitments that are meant to mitigate risks or provide support around worker or community racial equity issues, but they're much less likely to report out on concrete actions that in part illuminate their performance on certain elements of racial equity. Now, we'll get into that in a moment, but just so you know, only 18 companies out of the 100 have at least one commitment or action within each of our 6 different dimensions, and not a single company has implemented all 22 of the commitments or actions within our tracker overall, which means that there's room for improvement. Taking a look a little deeper, this tree map shows the number of companies that have a specific action or a commitment within the certain dimensions. And now here you can get that trend of how companies are faring when it comes to action versus commitment. Largely, you can see actions and commitments are denoted by an A or a C. And what you find is that things that are labeled C, those data points that are labeled C, tend to have a higher number of companies that are disclosing on them versus things that are labeled A with action tend to have a much lower number of companies. Drilling down into anti-discrimination policies really makes this trend pop. You see that when it comes to having an EEO policy, which is an equal employment opportunity or a diversity and opportunity policy, anti-harassment policies, discrimination, grievance mechanisms, harassment grievance mechanisms, all of these policies tend to be commitments, and nearly 100% of companies tend to have them. When taking a look at anti-harassment training and quantitative diversity targets, we see that less than a third of companies have these specific actions. Now, what I've demonstrated is the overall trends in the tracker, but the tracker is good for digging into data on specific topics as well. And we'll see this with pay equity as an example. So to give you some context on the overall state of pay inequities in the US, according to research by the Economic Policy Institute in 2019, Black workers' wages at the median were 76% of those of white workers, which is about a $10,000 per year gap. Hispanic and Latinx workers had around a $11,000 per year gap. And while the pay gap between Hispanic and Latinx workers and white workers has been reducing over the past 2 decades, we've seen that the Black and white wage gap has been growing. The trends become even starker when we take a look at this at an intersectional level, in taking a look at gender and race. It becomes really clear that women of color are have the largest pay gaps in comparison to white men. According to the National Partnership for Women and Families in 2019, Black women were paid 63% of white men in terms of median earnings, and Latino women were paid 55%. So let's bring this back to the context of the racial equity tracker. Overall, we find that low disclosure in pay equity is part of the trends of the tracker, and it really masks the true state of racial pay equity when it comes to the largest companies. Even among the 100 largest companies in the US, less than a third of them disclose conducting a pay equity analysis, despite it being a corporate action that companies can take to identify pay gaps and ameliorate them. Even fewer companies are disclosing the results of these pay gap analyses, which end up being in really non-standardized formats. The distribution of wage gaps themselves, the pay ratios, reveals that companies tend to report on results only when their adjusted ratios are closer to 100%, making it incomparable to the larger trends that we see in the US, and really standing at odds with the narrative that we see about the broader state of pay equity and racial pay equity specifically in the United States. So let's dig into the data from the tracker. Like I mentioned before, about 31% of companies disclose that they conduct a racial pay equity analysis. When it comes to reporting results, 15% report adjusted or unadjusted pay ratios, and 7% of companies report that there are no statistically significant differences between pay between white and non-white workers. Taking a look at the distribution, which we also pull from the tracker, we see that most companies reporting adjusted pay ratios, which are essentially pay ratios that adjust for the similarities between workers, all of these tend to hover around the 1-to-1 ratio. And it tells us, again, that companies feel more comfortable reporting ratios when they're closer to perfect, and it gives us a false impression of racial equity across the largest 100 companies in the racial equity tracker. So there's a lot of room for improvement, and there's a lot of room for learning that there's accountability in disclosing the results, even when they're not perfect. And with that, we'll take it to the company spotlight with Yusuf and our guest from Intel.
That's a really particular way to lead into this conversation to talk about why transparency matters. And Susanna, I actually want to start there. We often lift up Intel as an example of a company who believes in the importance of transparency, who discloses along the way. and wanted to hear from you specifically why. Like, why is that of importance? Why would you take the leap to doing that?
Yeah, and thank you so much. And really happy to be here for this discussion, and congrats on the release of the report. And the tracker. I think for us, and it's not specific to diversity and inclusion, but I think what we've found in all of our work on corporate responsibility and kind of ESG reporting is the transparency has really helped us to drive results over time. I think, you know, we are a data-driven company and a data-driven industry. It's how we manage and report in very detailed ways with our executives across all of our work. And so that was helpful in our culture to kind of also apply it, you know, to our diversity and inclusion work as well. I think the other piece that's been important is having goal setting and public goals out, I think, and you have to have the data and the transparency to really know how you're doing for those goals. And one thing we get asked by a lot of other companies is kind of how to get started in this space. And we've been reporting, like you said, for a long time. Our first diversity inclusion reporting started back in 2002. But I think being able to kind of show over time, you know, how this transparency has helped us to have the right conversations, has helped us to, you know, narrow in on the areas where we found gaps and where we have to go faster. And then when from that, setting goals to really drive the whole company and different parts of the organization kind of in the right direction. So for example, we met our 2020 goal to achieve full representation in our US workforce, both for women and underrepresented minorities. We achieved that 2 years ahead of schedule. And then when we set and announced our new 2030 goals last year, the data had showed us we really still had more work to do in both our senior leadership representation for women and underrepresented minorities. So we set a goal there to double representation over the next decade. And then we also found that we really weren't where we wanted to be in terms of women in technical roles. So we were at 25% of women in technical roles. We're going to set a goal to get there to 40%. And what that has driven is the supplementing actions inside the company to move in that direction.
One of the things that I hear from companies is there are barriers to disclosing, right? You know, even though the CEO is really energized about it, when it comes to legal, sometimes there's sort of a stopping point, or even HR in getting the data, right? So you talk about setting the goal and narrowing the gap, but what about the internal work to actually disclose on this to get that over the line?
Yeah, I think the most important thing is exactly what you talked about is really understanding and having that close partnership with your legal teams, with your HR organizations, to really look at the data, understand the data, do benchmarking, right? Understand which other companies and your peers are doing this disclosure, and also knowing you don't have to do all the disclosure all at once. So understand, you know, how do you do this in an incremental way that helps people get comfort with that direction. And so we've had those discussions over many years, but I think it's also really helped to bring in that outside perspective. So the tracker is a great way, I think, for companies to leverage and be able to, you know, maybe take a couple of those issues and look and share that information internally about where your company is compared to others. And one of the other barriers that we've found over time is really the question of what it takes to actually drive results. So it's not just barriers to disclosure, but it's barriers to making progress on goals and making progress on these really complex and interconnected issues. One of the things that we've found is it's been really important to take the steps over the last few years to really integrate accountability into different systems. So it's one thing to set a goal that you want to increase representation or you want to get to pay equity. How do you make sure those things are integrated into your hiring practices and expectations, right? So we've actually put in place, you know, requirements for any hiring manager to take inclusive hiring training before they can even open a rec in the company, to integrate that into our employee surveys. So we have it not as a separate survey in diversity inclusion, but it's part of our core employee experience survey. And then tying to performance management systems, making sure that inclusion is really how we're looking at managers, leaders, but also our employees. How are they helping us advance a culture of inclusion? And one key piece, everyone cares about pay. So it's really been helpful for us to link a portion of every employee and executive compensation to these diversity metrics and continue to have that discussion throughout the year of how we're trending on that and how everyone plays a role and everyone's pay will go up or down depending upon if we achieve those. So really that integration with systems is critical.
Yeah, actually, that's a really great point. You know, one of the criticisms that I've heard from the equity world is that it's great that companies are committing to advancing equity, but how is it integrated into their business practices, performance management? I mean, you talked about um, exec comp and worker comp, but you know, what about products? You know, how are you thinking about products and services and creating or applying a racial equity lens to that?
Yeah, one thing that was really that when we set out our 2030 goals, that was really the biggest difference from when we set our 2020 goals, where the 2020 goals were really focused more on our own operations. The new 2030 goals are really looking at how do we drive change across the industry, and also how do we, really look at our products and how technology can be applied to be part of the solution. And so one of the things we recently launched about just two weeks ago is something called the Alliance for Global Inclusion. That's a coalition of companies, including Dell, NTT Data, Snap Inc., and NASDAQ actually, to really come together to drive collective action around issues that kind of get at some of that product piece. So it's not only about, we've got goals in 4 areas related to leadership representation, but also inclusive language in product development, so inclusive coding language, right? So we've undertaken some efforts inside Intel, but are working across the industry to make sure that, as people are trained to come into our industry, we don't have, things like blacklist, whitelist, master slave in some of this kind of core coding language, and really addressing that. The other piece is around inclusive product development, as you said. So how, when we're thinking about responsible AI, how do you make sure that people designing the algorithms, the data sets we're using, really you're addressing bias right through the process, and looking at kind of product usage. And then finally, that STEM readiness in communities. So on that last piece, not only we're going to drive that through the Alliance for Global Inclusion, but also we announced an initiative called the Intel Rise Technology Initiative, which are teams across Intel that are working with our customers on projects that we can help fund that address social equity and human rights. It's across all of our issues like sustainability and other things, but really having that dedicated focus on social equity and human rights for those projects, I think, is helping change that conversation inside Intel too, of how do we really look at that role of technology. And that also covers things like accessibility design as well.
One of the things that, in our work with PolicyLink and FSG, as we've created our CEO blueprint for racial equity and think about using that as a roadmap to sort of longer term standards, a common language around advancing racial equity with corporate America. What we've done is we've brought a lot of different players in, because we understand that both equity advocates, companies, investors need to have a sort of a say in how we think about it holistically, the ecosystem of it. And I'm hearing you talk about this alliance and thinking about what it takes to stand up an initiative like this. What is the work required to actually, across companies, across different industries, say, this is how we're going to define what a good product offering looks like? Just interested in that.
Yeah, I think first it's just bringing companies together. Obviously, and a lot of these are also very large companies, although with the Alliance, we're really looking to bring in companies from all sizes and come together. But really, it was a year-long process of starting the conversations. It was our Chief Diversity Inclusion Officer having those discussions with her peers at other companies, and saying, what are you working on? What are those, can we align on some collective areas that we can leverage our strengths in our programs that we're working on, so that we don't all have to do each part of it, but how do we really kind of bring that expertise to the table? So we'd already had some of those discussions with some of the partners who are our customers already, but then kind of looking at how do we combine efforts. So I think it's dialogue, it's discussion, it's having a structure and a forum to have those regular conversations, and then creating what we've launched on the website, it's allianceforglobalinclusion.com, is an index that we're working to kind of leverage the data from our companies and other companies to help others be able to start the conversation inside their companies as well. So I think it's kind of having a structure, it's having kind of collective data, it's having a few key areas that you can collaborate on together, and moving that forward.
I have two questions for you, but
Yeah,
there's one that did come in
Mhm.
from the attendees
Mhm.
that looks really interesting. And the question from Sapna is, you mentioned that Intel set a new goal to double women in leadership and in tech by 2030. So how did you determine this goal is realistic and attainable? So why increase from 20 to 40 versus 30 to 50?
Yeah, and obviously we spent a lot of time modeling things out, and I would say, you know, when we landed on the goal, I mean, part of the discussion was we don't know exactly how we're going to get there. We have some paths and we have some, you know, scenarios that we've done, but we also know it's not something that we're going to do just by hiring our way into it, that it's going to take, you know, these broader efforts to work across the industry, to look at career pathways into the industry, to kind of collaborate on kind of broadening the complete talent pool. But you can imagine it's a 10-year goal. There's a lot that has to happen between then and now. So the conversations inside the company, we've gotten that question from employees of how are we going to get there, right? Really having that discussion of it's not going to be one thing we do. It's what we're going to do to, you know, continue to drive that integration of systems and really making sure we're looking at kind of talent, you know, hiring, progression and retention, but also how are we looking at things like Global Alliance, the Alliance for Global Inclusion, and then also all the work that we do in education and investments in our communities for STEM education and increasingly around, you know, we have a program called AI for Youth, right? It's kind of looking at what are those next emerging technology skills that we have to prepare people for. So that kind of gets into some of those areas that are going to impact all businesses, not just in the tech industry.
Yep. And sort of the last question that I have on top of mind is around, you know, it is proxy season, right? There are, I'd say that the top two things on the docket are around racial equity and climate. And so curious about how the conversation has changed. You talked about the iterative nature of hitting those goals. How has the conversation itself changed over time with investors around these issues?
Yeah, no, and we do regular outreach with investors, you know, throughout the year and meet one-on-one and in group meetings. But we always do an outreach during proxy season as well. And one thing I think we've seen this year compared to, you know, past years is this significant increase in a focus on social issues, including racial justice issues, really looking at disclosure. So I think that's, you know, one piece that, you know, we're continuing to kind of talk about and where are those areas that, you know, we can continue to improve. But it's also, I think, this increased focus on action, like you're talking about here today, on what are your results, how are you working kind of beyond your own operations. It includes, you know, how are you looking at supplier diversity. You know, we have a goal to double our spending with suppliers owned with diverse businesses over the next decade. How are you integrating it into that as well? But I have definitely seen not only a significant increase in ESG interest overall, but I think certainly as they are trying to figure out how do they measure sometimes what's harder to quantify in this space. So I think any trackers like this or guidance in terms of how are you looking at human capital management and generally, and then within that kind of the diversity, equity, inclusion issues is something that we're seeing a lot more focus on.
Yeah, that's right. You know, we stood up the tracker as this is the current state of disclosure.
Mhm.
I'm going to talk a little bit in a moment. I think we're sort of at time now, Suzanne.
Yeah,
Although
exactly.
I do want to talk to you some more. We do have to move on a bit. So thank you. But I will talk about what does come next. Appreciate your insights and your learnings. And it's really great to hear about the Alliance.
Thank you.
So just to spend a little bit of time on what's next, you know, the idea is for us putting out data, insights and analysis is key, right? Everything that we talked about, both from the pay equity standpoint and what I just talked to Suzanne about regarding performance metrics and showing what progress looks like. It's one of the key reasons we stood up this tracker. And over the course of the next few months, we'll be digging into very specific elements, the different dimensions of it. And so on the right side, you see what we're going to be releasing in May, June, and July. Along with that, we believe it is important to tell corporate stories. And so we have an ongoing leadership series where we interview executives around, you know, what are the barriers? What are the challenges? How do you get to a point where you are working towards being best in class or best in the industry? And so our leadership series really digs into that and unpacks these stories. And then the longer term idea is that we're going to be building out the tracker, both to increasing the size of companies that we include in it, but also the different data points that we're going to aggregate. And this is, as I mentioned before, as Catalina mentioned, this is really version 1 of the tracker. We wanted to make sure that there was a framework to understand the current state of disclosure. And then from there, we'll be moving on to what are the other dimensions of thinking about racial equity. And we can sort of take some questions on that in the Q&A. And just the very last slide, I mentioned this, I touched on it, but we are working with PolicyLink and FSG really to create racial equity standards over the course of the long term. We have a few, we released a CEO blueprint for racial equity in July of last year. Next month, we'll actually be releasing an update to it. But prior to that, we spent a lot of time talking to corporate leaders, C-suite leaders, CEOs around what is it that we were missing from that initial blueprint. And we'll be releasing corporate insights into that next week. So we're hosting a webinar. We are happy to send details about it. Both Ben and Jerry's is going to be on there. The former CEO, Rose Macari, the former CEO of Patagonia, will be on that call. So it'll be a really great event if folks want to chime in on that. And lastly, I do want to just, a plug for Intel. If there are other companies on the line who are interested in learning more about their Alliance for Global Inclusion, there's an email, Patricia. You can reach out to her directly and she'll provide you with some more insights. So with that, we'll pause and we'll take some questions from the audience.
Wonderful. Thanks so much. We have gotten a few questions from the audience, and maybe the first one is pretty high level, and I'll kick it off to you, Kavya. But we're really asking, how are we defining pay equity?
Absolutely. So when we think about this conceptually, like aside from our tracker, pay equity is defined as the difference or achieving median earning ratio equity between non-white and white workers in the context of kind of racial equity, but generally it's thought of the ratio of median earnings of one group to the ratio of median earnings of another group. When thinking about pay equity in the tracker, of course, there are many different elements that companies actually disclose. So in the tracker, we actually have a number of different data points that tries to capture this, which is whether a company is conducting an analysis by race and ethnicity, the frequency with which they're conducting these analysis, the year that was previous analysis was conducted, the type of results that a company might be releasing, and then whether they're actually disclosing the non-white to white pay gap. And companies tend to disclose this in a variety of ways. Sometimes it'll be an adjusted pay gap. So that's when you're controlling for workers who have similar backgrounds on a variety of different features. And sometimes it's a raw pay gap, which is the literal comparison of median earnings of one group to the median earnings of another group.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Kavya. We are getting a few more questions. I'm just trying to sort through them. The next one, maybe, Kavya, you can go over as well, is about elaborating on Board of Diversity disclosures.
Absolutely.
So
the Board of Diversity disclosure that we have here is actually measured in one data point under our racial and ethnic demographic data or diversity data dimension. So it's measuring whether companies are actively disclosing the racial or ethnic breakdown of their board of directors. A lot of times companies may disclose gender breakdowns, and we're seeing a trend of more companies disclosing racial and ethnic breakdowns of the board of directors as well. And so that's what that particular data point is capturing.
Wonderful. And I will kick the next one off to Yusuf because it is about our data and data portal times for Just Capital.
So, the issues that we're measuring in the tracker and our traditional corporate data review period will kick off in July of this year, and it'll last 5 weeks. That all of the information used in the portal will be used in our rankings. And I'll just be frank, it differs slightly than what we are tracking in our tracker. It's a bit of a different timeline. And so I just wanted to name that and mention that.
Thanks, Yusuf. We also got another question about restating how the data was collected, whether it was done via survey or our search of publicly available information. I'll let Kavya answer that question.
Sure. Like with the rest of our data that we collect, we're pulling that information from CSR reports, diversity and inclusion reports, and other company materials that you have on your websites. And so the entire impetus for that is around disclosure being a measure of accountability towards progress on racial equity. And so all of the data that's in the tracker comes from our analysts going out and searching through the websites of all of the different companies in the Russell 1000, and specifically the 100 companies featured in this tracker, to pull down any information that we find about these 22 different data points.
Yep.
And for what it's worth, if companies do have updates to this data, we have a process by which you're more than welcome to engage in to go ahead and update that data. And so if you reach out to our corporate engagement team, corporateengage@justcapital.com, Yusuf and Kata would be more than happy to kind of give you some directions on what that looks like.
And just to tie on to that one, if you're interested in receiving the deck for this call, which we've gotten a few questions, you can reach out to that same email, corpengage@justcapital.com, and we'll be happy to share this. Our next question, I'm going to kick off to you, Yusuf. We mentioned that we got our data points from the public, and this person is wondering what we think might be missing by only having this lens on data points.
I think that's a great question. We know for a fact that what we're measuring isn't the gamut of measuring racial equity. There are elements of environmental justice. We measure environmental issues as an organization because it falls under the lens of stakeholder capitalism. But we have made the choice in this moment to not add that to the tracker, given the state of disclosure across the 1,000 companies on environmental justice related issues. So as I did mention before, this is version 1. It is the current state of disclosure across these 6 domains. The idea is that we continue to engage on transparency on issues that matter. And we work with our partners who are racial equity advocates to really help inform how we are measuring companies on racial equity related issues. So being informed by the public really is our bread and butter, but it isn't the gamut of what we're going to be looking towards as we continue to expand the tracker.
Thanks, Yusuf. One more for you, Kavya, on gender balanced leadership. Can you maybe delve into our focus on gender balanced leadership, percentage of women on board, CEO and executive level, and what we're looking at there?
Absolutely. So while it's not featured in the racial equity tracker, these are things that we do collect. Otherwise, we are collecting data points around whether there are actual disclosures of the gender breakdown of the board of directors and the percentage of women on the board. We also have workforce demographic data that we collect more broadly. In fact, we're in progress on collecting some of that now on gender in the larger organization as well. And so those are things that, while you might not see in the racial equity tracker, are featured as part of our general rankings process too.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Kavya. I'm just looking through the questions and seeing which ones we have already answered. Maybe we can talk about some of the barriers and challenges that companies are seeing that could prevent them from being best in class. And Yusuf or Kavya, I think both of you are very equipped to answer this one.
Yusuf, feel free to go first.
Disclosure. I mean, I think that's step one. Everything that we discussed with Suzanne is that our core belief is if companies aren't transparent about it from the beginning, we don't actually know what performance looks like versus their peers or across the industry. So you can't be best in class without showcasing that you're actually best in class. And I would also argue that in what we see with pay equity is companies are oftentimes don't actually report until they're like, okay, we're good, we've hit par. Well, that's actually not what we understand. We, as one of the stakeholders of companies, understand that when it comes to stakeholder capitalism and being a top performer, it's a journey. We get that. When it comes to racial equity issues, obviously it's a journey. And so the pressure from investors, from ranker raters agencies, from employees, from customers is really to understand what that journey looks like really tangibly, so that what we can do is we can award companies, we could also showcase them, we could provide guidance and best practice guides to showcasing how they became a best-in-class type of company. And I can keep going, but I'll let Kavya go.
I'll also add, I think the points that Yusuf raised are really important and the starting point for all companies in trying to think about what sort of barriers they have to overcome. But I think one that gets lost a little bit in the disclosure scene, we focus a lot on disclosure and what companies are doing when it comes to publicly announcing that they're committing to a certain policy or committing to a certain action. But one of the things that gets lost a little bit in the DEI conversation and the racial equity conversations is also the cultivation of culture and belonging within the organization. And there's a lot of work that has to be done on that side that's interpersonal, that is around hierarchies, is around power structures and imbalances there that require a very different sort of work. So even while disclosure may be improving and while commitments may be improving and actions may be taken, there's a level of work too that exists on a slightly different plane that's important for increasing belonging and that sense of inclusion that employees have if you're thinking about it at that level. I think the other barrier is a lot of this is concentrated on workers and maybe some of the direct impacts on communities, but racial equity issues span across multiple stakeholders. And so in thinking about how the history of racism and racial inequality has trickled into every single domain of life, it's important for companies to think about how those dynamics impact the different stakeholders, whether it's thinking about it from an environmental lens or thinking about it from a customer lens. And all of those things become a little bit more challenging and a little bit more nuanced based on the type of interaction that companies have already with those specific stakeholders. And that's where we see some more of those barriers as well, both on the measurement side, but then on the action side too.
Thank you so much, Kavya, for adding that. And with that, we've run a little bit over time, but again, just want to thank Yusuf, Suzanne, Kavya, and everybody for joining us. As we said in the chat, please reach out to CorpEngage at justcapital.com if you have additional questions, if you want access to the tracker, or if you want us to connect you with our partners at Intel for joining their new
Alliance for Global.
Wonderful. So thank you, everybody. And with that, we'll let you go. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Take care.
Take care.